Okay, great. There we go. Thank you for that ask. That is very helpful. Okay, great. So thank you all for being here again. So we're here today to talk a bit about water and a bit about plastics as two separate issues, but also as issues that inevitably intersect with each other and affect one another. Okay, so just in terms of what we're gonna go through tonight, we're just gonna first introduce ourselves, introduce environmental justice, what that is, what we're talking about tonight, and also reproductive justice. And as a reproductive justice organization, the links between environmental justice and reproductive justice. And then we're going to talk about plastics, then we'll talk a bit about water, and then we'll just have some closing thoughts and a little closing poll. And throughout, you should feel free to ask questions in the chat. You can raise your little Zoom hand. And Tiana, do let me know if anything pops up that I don't see, because the little top Zoom bar is fairly invisible to me in screen share mode. Okay, so I think to kick us off, Tiana's just gonna say a little bit about who we are, what we do, and the connection between EJ and RJ.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Tiana Shaw-Wakeman. I serve as the Environmental Justice Program Manager here at Black Women for Wellness. And at BWW, we have a myriad of programs. Our organizational mission is to support the health and well-being of Black women and girls. And we do this through health education, outreach, empowerment, and research. And on our environment, we have many different programs, everything from sexual health and education, food distribution, and then what we do on the environmental justice side of things. So we kind of split our team into two buckets. Both buckets are about how systemic injustice and racism means that Black women and Black girls often experience a higher toxic load, both in their environment, so your neighborhood, and through personal care products or the products that you might use on your hair, skin, body, etc. So the two bucket categories we think of those as: one is through our built environment, and second, beauty justice. Today, we're going to be focusing in on our built environment work and focusing on two specific areas, which is water equity and plastics pollution. But we also do work around eliminating neighborhood oil drilling, and we're starting a project around green social housing. On the beauty justice side of things, we have work around understanding personal care product use, so toothpaste, feminine hygiene, things like that, fragrance use among Black and Latina women, and kind of intervening around how we can support people to transition to cleaner products and then also change the market to provide cleaner products. And that's our taking stock study. And we also do events around healthy hair and education, and breast health, and how breast health and breast cancer are connected to personal care products as well. So that's a bit about the program. And today we're going to be focusing in on the built environment side. And Zoe is our wonderful environmental justice program coordinator, who's going to take most of it from here. And then we do have one more slide related to RJ. So a question that we get is kind of, what does the environment have to do with reproductive justice? Because when people think reproductive justice, they often think reasonably about abortion access and about bodily autonomy and about maternal health and right to have a child or not to have a child. And those are all completely true. And BWW works on all of those things. But RJ actually has, reproductive justice has 4 tenets, and the tenets are listed here. It's the right to have a child, the right to not have a child, and the third is actually the right to parent the children we have in safe and healthy conditions, regardless of age, race, gender, immigration status, ability, etc. And then the last is the right to bodily autonomy. Environmental justice is a very similar principle, which is that everybody, regardless of who you are, nationality, race, income status, have a right to equal protection from environmental harms and have a right to raise your families if you choose to have a family and to exist in safe and clean neighborhoods. So there's a lot of links just even in the definition of RJ and reproductive justice, reproductive and environmental justice. But then it's also true that as we uplift reproductive justice, we uplift environmental, and then so on. And specifically for water contamination and plastics, these are issues that really particularly affect people of color and communities of color, specifically Black communities, and then even more specifically Black communities in South Los Angeles, which is where our organization is located. And then in this presentation, and then in others, if you come to our other BWW events, we'd often draw out some of how certain environmental harms particularly harm reproductive health. And we'll hear that related to some of the contaminants in water and plastic in the presentation as well. So that's just to say that even though we are a reproductive justice organization, environmental justice is right at home here. And I'll pass it over to Zoe to continue us. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Tiana. Okay, so just to get us started here tonight, if I can get Zoom to cooperate with me, here we go. I just wanted to kick us off with a short poll. So the spoiler's already out there on the slide. The poll's just gonna, if I can launch, there we go. Let me know if you can't see that, but you should see a poll. It's just 2 questions for you to fill out there, just about how strongly you agree with the 2 statements. So whether you worry about the impact of plastic on your health and how strongly, and whether you worry about the quality of your tap water, and if so, how much. So I'll just give you like a minute or so to get that going. And I can see a bunch of you filling it out already. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay. I think we're almost there. So I'm just gonna give it another second, and then I will bring the poll to a close. Okay, great. So if I can share the results there. So thank you all for taking part in the poll, for answering. Although I now see that I ended up with 7 people responding to the first question and only 6 to the second. So I'm so sorry if I cut someone off in terms of your poll responses. But yeah, essentially I can see that all of you do worry about the impact of plastic on your health to some degree, right? And that you will worry about the quality of your tap water, again, to some degree. So hopefully, thank you all for taking part in that. And hopefully this presentation will be able to shed some light on the ways in which plastic and plastic pollution affect our health, and the way that tap water and the quality of our tap water can affect our health, and also things that we can potentially try to do about that, right? Like how we can try and address the concerns that we have. Okay, so let's start off by talking a bit about plastic. So how plastic affects our health. So I just wanted to start off with some open questions for those of you who are attending. And you all said that you worry sometimes about plastic affecting your health, right? So I guess I'm just wondering like what you're specifically worried about, right? Like how often do you think you use items that are made of plastic or that contain plastic? And which kind of plastic items do you think you use the most often? And feel free to come off mute if you want to talk, or also feel free to just drop something in the chat, but no pressure. Okay, also no worries if, you know, here we go in the chat. I use products with plastic daily. It's near impossible to avoid. That's Nikita. My family uses water bottles daily. Yeah, thank you for contributing. I think some of those are some of the, I use a lot of plastic because it's just convenient. Yeah, I think all of that's right? Like I use plastic all the time too, right? Like I'm sure Tiana does too, right? Like no matter how much you know about plastic or how much you worry about plastic, inevitably the world that has been built around us is just so full of plastic that even if we try to be really conscientious, inevitably we're using it all the time, right? So one of you said water bottles, food storage, that's true. Like lots of us use it for food storage in the form of like Tupperwares, right? Like you go to the supermarket, you buy stuff, probably the stuff that you buy from the supermarket, at least some of it is packaged in plastic, and then you bring it home and it's still packaged in plastic. And of course you just put it away like that. Like, you know, who's got the time to to sort through all of their food items and take it out of the plastic and so on. So yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that's exactly right. Like plastic is super ubiquitous, and that's why it's really hard for us to get away from it, and also really important for us to talk about and think about the effect that the plastics that we use might be having on us. Yeah, thank you, Serena. So yeah, plastics are a major part of our lives, but you try to limit your use of single-use plastics like plastic bags, utensils, and water bottles. And that's great. Like that's like some of the great stuff that we can do as we consciously try to think about how to move away from using quite so much plastic, right? Okay. Thank you all for sharing. I very much appreciate it. So, as we were saying, plastic is everywhere in our lives, right? Plastic's all around us and we all use it all the time because of course we do, because it's, as I said, ubiquitous, right? So it's in food packaging, like we said, it's in water bottles. And also on this slide, I've just put some of the places that plastic can be found that is like more surprising, right? Because it's not what we tend to think of when we think about how there's plastic in lots of our stuff, right? Like there's plastic in chewing gum, there's plastic in lots of our clothes and synthetic clothing. So that's just man-made clothing, right? So mostly stuff that's like polyester, nylon, acrylic. I think they're the main kind of man-made clothes that are like, those fabrics just are like plastic fabrics, right? There's lots of small bits of plastic in cosmetics, even in paper cups. This one I found really depressing when I learned it, because, you know, you think you're doing a really good thing by using a paper cup in a cafe instead of, a styrofoam cup. But then like the lining that they use in those paper cups is like has plastic in it, because that's what, makes it slightly heat resistant and so on. So yeah, plastic is everywhere. Okay, so why are we talking about plastic? I mean, we're talking about plastic because it's everywhere in our lives, right? But by this, I mean, when we talk about plastic as a kind of environmental issue, or as an environmental issue, generally what we mean by that, or what people tend to talk about, is they talk about the problem that we see here in this image, right? So they talk about plastic waste and how there's plastic waste everywhere. There's plastic waste in the ocean. Fish are consuming the plastic waste that's in the ocean. We've got this big problem where we're just producing all this plastic and we don't have anywhere for it to go, right? And I think in environmental spaces, or when people talk about plastic pollution as a worry, as something that we should care about, that tends to be like the focus of the conversation, And of course, this is important, right? Like it's important to think about plastic waste because that is a big issue and it is an environmental issue, and it does affect certain communities and developing countries more than it affects like richer Western countries and so on. But it's also not the whole problem, right? Because I think what's often left out of the conversation, and what we're trying to emphasize in this environmental justice space, is that also the manufacture, the transport, the creation of plastic, and the ways that we use plastic are also forms of pollution that also affect us, affect our health, and also that particularly end up impacting the health disproportionately of low-income communities and communities of color. So to get at what I mean by that a bit more, we like to talk about what we call the life cycle of plastic. So the life cycle of plastic is just thinking about plastic pollution comprehensively, right? So thinking about plastic pollution in all the stages of its life, right? Including its manufacture, its use, and so on. So I'll just talk briefly through the stages here in this diagram. So the life cycle of plastic starts with extraction, right? So it starts with extraction because plastics essentially are made of fossil fuels, right? They're made from oil and gas that are extracted from the ground. And that extraction is very relevant to us here in LA because LA is a big oil drilling city. As Tiana mentioned at the beginning, we're involved in a campaign to phase out that oil drilling. But the start of the manufacture of plastic involves taking fossil fuels out of the earth, which is bad for the environment, but also bad for us, right? It's bad for people living near, those of us who live near that oil drilling, because the extraction of fossil fuels causes health harms to those that live near those facilities. Thank you for answering the question, or thank you for handling the chat, Tiana. And then after extraction, so after the fossil fuels are taken out of the ground, those raw fossil fuel materials have to be transported, right? That transport involves diesel trucks. It involves more polluting materials that, again, bad for the environment and also particularly bad for people that live near those transit routes, right? And again, that always tends to be in neighborhoods and communities that have been disinvested in, which, surprise, surprise, tend to be low income, Black, brown communities. So then there's the refining of those fossil fuel materials so that they can be turned into plastics. Those facilities, again, tend to be concentrated in neighborhoods that are, again, low-income communities of color. So there's like a particular track known as Cancer Alleyway, right? So like in Louisiana, etc., where a lot of these facilities are based, and lots of these facilities that end up turning fossil fuels into petrochemicals, which are the basis of plastics. And those facilities are very toxic, right? They're very toxic, they're very polluting. They really affect like Black communities, Latino communities predominantly, and they're very damaging. Production, similar story. Distribution, again, all of these stages of production, manufacture of plastics all involve these harms that are very damaging to environmental justice communities, right? And then consumption is the bit that we're essentially going to end up talking about for the rest of this plastic section. So consumption is just the life cycle of plastic. That's the ways that plastic causes pollution, causes negative health impacts, like while we're just using those plastic products in the world. So the ways that we use plastic in our daily lives, like the water bottles that we use, the food packaging plastic, the gum that we're chewing that has plastic in it, and so on. And then the final stage is disposal. So the stage where essentially trying to get rid of the plastics, all the plastics that we've produced, and that again has all these toxic effects and all these polluting effects, because essentially lots of plastic will end up either in landfill or in which, again, bad for the environment, bad for the people living near the landfill, or plastic is incinerated, again, bad for the environment, bad for the people living near the incinerators, or the plastic just ends up as waste in the oceans or in those big dumps like we saw in the image. So the point is that all of these different stages, right, impact our health. They impact our health and they impact the environment around us. Okay. So now I'm going to focus a bit more on the consumption stage. So on like the way that we in our daily lives use plastic and the way that that plastic impacts our health, and then things that we can do about that. Okay. So like I said plastics are made from fossil fuels. So they're mostly made from natural oil and gas. But I'd say most plastic items that we use, that we interact with in our lives, they're kind of made up 50% of that fossil fuel stuff, right? And then 50% of what makes them plastic is chemicals that are then added to these fossil fuels to give them different properties, right? So to give them like different colors, to give them flexibility, stability, and so on, right? And actually, like the bullet points here, like interestingly, like the reason that there are so many chemicals in plastic is because they're made from fossil fuels, right? So fossil fuels are very flammable. So essentially all these different flame retardants, which are different kinds of chemicals, have to be added to plastics so that plastic items that we're using in our daily lives and that we're storing water in and storing our food in don't just catch on fire, right? So like what that means essentially is there's no way to make sustainable plastic, right? Like, of course not, because plastic's made of fossil fuels. That can't be sustainable in and of itself. And also you have to add these chemicals that are toxic because otherwise those fossil fuels will just burst into flame. Okay, so plastics in our daily lives. So chemicals from plastic packaging, or just plastic products in general, but packaging is particularly relevant, right? Because stuff that's in packaging tends to be stuff that we consume or put onto our bodies or put into our bodies in some way, right? So chemicals from plastic can leach into food, drinks, and products, right? So this is particularly important with things like plastic bottles that we keep drinks in and then consume those drinks, packaging that we keep food in and then we consume the food, right? So studies have shown that plastic bottles contain over 300 different chemicals, and of those, over 150 of them, so over half of the chemicals that are in plastic bottles, leach into the beverage that's in the bottle that we then consume, right? So we, by having lots of plastic in our lives, are inevitably taking in lots of the chemicals that come from those plastics, right? And some of these chemicals are what we call endocrine disrupting chemicals, right? And these ones are particularly important and particularly damaging to us because essentially what they do is they mess with our hormones, right? So they trick the body into thinking that these chemicals are hormones, which means that the normal functions of our body that are regulated by our hormones are disrupted because these chemicals that are acting like hormones but aren't actually hormones make our body do strange things that our bodies wouldn't normally do. We stress this particularly at BWW because endocrine disrupting chemicals are often particularly damaging for reproductive health, right? So like they can affect fertility, they can really affect pregnant women, and they're also like particularly disruptive to children, right? Because they can really interrupt like cognitive development and so on. Okay. So a thing to emphasize here is just, so I've said that like the chemicals leach out of plastic all the time, right? Like that's just a process that happens. But something that's really important to remember is that chemicals are particularly likely to leach from plastic when they're exposed to heat, right? And the reason that I mentioned this and that I put this image here is if you remember anything from this information about plastics, one thing to really remember is if you can, really try not to microwave your food in plastic, right? Because when you microwave your food in plastic, you're heating up that plastic. And when you heat up plastic, 100% inevitably, the chemicals will leach out, and they will leach out more quickly, right? So that just applies to anything in general that you think of that where plastic might get warm. So like another big one there is that if you do drink a lot of bottled water, or if your family drinks a lot of bottled water, like try to store that bottled water in places that aren't really hot. So like try not to keep them in the trunk of your car for ages where they're gonna be exposed to the sun and get really warm, because that will mean that your water will end up with more chemicals in it, because as the bottle heats up, those chemicals will go into the water, right? Yeah. Don't microwave your food in plastic. End of that story. When you can help it, you know. Okay. One of the other things I wanted to talk about with plastics in terms of how plastics affect us on a daily basis is microplastics, right? Microplastics are something that you might have heard of. Essentially, microplastics exist everywhere in our environment, and they exist because plastic as a material doesn't decompose, right? Plastic will never decompose. All plastic that has ever been produced still exists in the world in some form. Like what a scary thought. So when you get plastics that are particularly like plastics that are discarded and then they're like just broken down in the environment, like often I think like broken down in the ocean, right? So like when plastic waste ends up in the ocean and then the waves end up like buffeting the plastic here and there, and that plastic like really breaks down and like decomposes to the extent that it can decompose, right? Like that means that essentially the plastic gets smaller until it ends up into these tiny, tiny little pieces. I think microplastics are like pieces of plastic that are 5 millimeters or smaller. And these microplastics are super, super absorbent, right? So essentially that just means that all these different chemicals, like chemicals from these plastics, stick to the surface of them really easily. So they tend to be really toxic. And because they're so small, and because plastic's so ubiquitous, and because plastic doesn't decompose, essentially that means that microplastics can be found all over the place, right? Like they're everywhere. They're transported really easily too. Like they're transported in the air and like water vapor. Like when it rains, the rain has microplastics in it these days. So microplastics, a big issue. And even like the last bullet point I've got here, like microplastics have been found in the human body, right? Microplastics have been found everywhere in the human body. Like they're in our lungs, they're in our blood. They cross the placenta during pregnancy, which is scary. So when a baby is born, like the fetus already has microplastics in it because these microplastics are so ubiquitous and all the way around. Okay. So microplastics, there are a lot of them in bottled water, right? So like what I've just said in the previous slides about bottled water and how like the chemicals leach out into the water. Also, there are a lot of microplastics that come from bottles of water that will leach into the water that you're then drinking. There's microplastics in beer, there's microplastics in the air that we breathe, there's some microplastics in tap water. But I mean, note this one, and like this will come up again, and this will come up again when I talk about water later on. But there are far fewer microplastics in tap water in general than there are in bottled water, right? And I think the same is often true of chemicals too, right? And that's really because bottled water is housed in this plastic. And the plastic means that the water that's contained inside can't stay, like it doesn't matter if the bottled water, tells you that they've taken the water from a spring in the Alps in Switzerland or something, right? Like the water could have been really, really pure and fresh at the start, but once it's housed in that plastic, it's no longer that pure and that, free of toxins and good for you. Okay, so on the microplastics front, just again, two things that, like there's nothing that ultimately that we can do, like to stop ourselves from consuming any microplastics, because like I said, they're everywhere. So it would be a futile mission. But like small steps that we can take to reduce our exposure. Generally, like when the option is available to you, like we all drink bottled water sometimes, like I'm only human, so do I. But generally, like bottled water is not better for you than tap water or filtered water or however you normally drink your water, right? Like bottled water is not normally better because of like, number one, the chemicals that come from plastic, and number two, the high levels of microplastics. And then the other thing to say is just again about this synthetic clothing thing. So again, that's clothes made of like polyester, acrylic, nylon. Those clothes are essentially made of plastics. So when we wash them, when we put them in our washing machines and then run the load, then they, because they're made of plastic, release microplastics while they're being washed. And then those microplastics can, like go into our water systems, potentially can like rub off, well, that's the wrong way of saying it. They can like leach into us as we wear those clothes then after they've been washed. So generally, again, when you can, and like none of this advice is like binding, or you should never feel bad about not following this advice. Like I wear synthetic clothes all the time. Again, I'm only human and I live in this world that's been set up in such a way that plastics are everywhere, right? Like none of us are suggesting that you should, go out and immediately throw all your polyester in the bin. But just generally, like natural fabrics, when you can choose them and when it makes sense to choose them and when it's the right affordable option, are generally better for your health. So like cotton, silk, things that are made of natural fibers. Okay. And then I'm going to come to a close in the plastic section fairly soon, but I wanted to just stop and say something about recycling before we move on, because recycling is always touted, right, as the big solution to the plastics problem, like the big solution to the problem of plastic pollution. But I just wanted to emphasize essentially that recycling is not not ultimately a solution, right? Like recycling is not ultimately going to get us out of this bind. Recycling certainly doesn't help with the health impacts that I've been talking about that plastic can have on us when we just like use plastic products, right? Like if those plastic products are recycled into plastic products, like they're still going to damage our health. So why is recycling a false solution? So firstly, just most plastic that's produced isn't recycled, right? So in the US, less than 10% of plastic has been recycled, even when we try really, really hard to make sure that we put all of our things in the right bins and so on, like most plastic, just for a bunch of reasons, will not be recycled, right? And then number two, even if that recycling did help, right, even if it were 100% efficient, right? Like the process of manufacture of plastics, so like the extraction of the fossil fuels, the refinement of those fossil fuels into petrochemicals and so on, will still harm human health and the environment. So recycling is not going to fix that problem. The third problem, recycled plastic is lower grade, so it's like a lower quality. So like once you recycle plastic once, it's slightly less robust than it was the first time round. So for example, if you have plastic that was in a water bottle and then you recycle it, that means it will be a slightly worse quality plastic. So the recycled plastic can't be used for water bottles anymore. It has to be used for something else. Like it could be turned into a bag or something, used for something else. So that means that then they're still going to keep creating plastic then to use for water bottles, right? If you can't recycle a water bottle to produce another water bottle. Fourth, making new plastic is cheaper than recycling old plastic, essentially. So like big industries aren't incentivized to recycle. And then 5, just recycling as a solution to plastic pollution and all the problems that plastic pollution comes with has always been a myth, right? So the oil and gas industry have spent millions and millions of dollars convincing the public that recycling is a solution, that we can get out of all of these problems through recycling. Like the fact that, the fact that the way that when you have like plastic products and they have that little like, recycling thing on the bottom, well, that little like thing with the arrows on the bottom and then there's a number in it. And like what that is that's the thing telling you what kind of plastic you're dealing with. It doesn't necessarily tell you that the plastic that you're holding is recyclable, but it looks like it's telling you that because it's got the little arrows. That's like the oil and gas industry on purpose repurposing that little symbol with the arrows so that it looks like all plastic can potentially be recycled, even though it actually can't, right? Okay. And yeah, I see Tiana in the chat. Again, wonderfully responding to all your comments. And yeah, I know it's overwhelming and it's a lot of information, but like certainly none of this information is supposed to make you feel like you can't do anything that you are already doing in the world. Because like I say, like none of these problems are our fault and we can't take on the burden of trying to protect ourselves from everything or trying to fix all of those problems all at once. There are just some small things that you can do that make life a bit easier or that mean you can avoid some of those problems if you so choose to. But certainly you shouldn't feel like you have to do everything at once or that, that it's bad to, to ever wear synthetic clothes or to ever drink out of water bottles or so on, because like it's just not reasonable and you have to balance like protecting yourself and making these decisions with just like living life and, and so on. So, I know it's hard, but I'm just saying, don't feel bad and don't feel like any of this is like really strongly your responsibility. Okay. I mean, essentially that's what I've put in this little yellow box here, right? Just that like these systems are bigger than us. The companies that are creating most of the plastic and polluting most of the world with it are not companies that we agree with or that we buy into. So, okay. So essentially on this slide, I just wanted to ask you now, so like this is me done with the information portion of the plastic section. So this is just sort of me asking you, yeah, and I think some of you already said this at the start, like that, you try and avoid using single-use plastic items whenever you can, but just like, I was just curious if any of you have thoughts about potential solutions or like things that you can implement in your own life or in your community or like things that you would like to see happen to try to either like protect yourself against some of these health harms associated with plastics, to try and stop there from being so much plastic in your home or in your community or any of the above. And again, as with the previous question, feel free to share in the chat, but there's also no pressure.
One of the solutions, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the solutions that I'm trying to implement in our home to reduce plastic use is we recently got a water filter, compliments of Black Women for Wellness from the last event I went to. And also, instead of buying all those little plastic baggies, Ziplocs, I've recently purchased some of those silicone reusable bags, as well as yeah, those bags are great. And just being more conscious, like not microwaving anything that's plastic in the microwave to reheat my food, buying more glass containers to put the food in and store it in the refrigerator. So just being more conscious about that. And this has been really helpful, the things you're sharing. I just recently learned about the recycling of the water bottles because I thought I was doing something great, recycling And I just recently learned what you posted, that a lot of it is not getting recycled, and then the quality is reduced each time as well. And it's just the endless cycle. So thank you for sharing this. Definitely.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's really exciting. I will say I do, as much as we like to very be clear that recycling is not a solution, just because fossil fuel companies love to say that it is. I've even gotten commercials that are like, "We're making plastic more recyclable," and they're at like advertising for themselves. But as it relates, at least I will say in Southern California, in Los Angeles specifically, I do think still that recycling, if you do use plastic water bottles for your home, recycling those in bins and glass bottles in bins is still pretty helpful, because California has that incentive program where people can get 5 cents or 10 cents per bottle, and that stream is a little bit more clean. It's more so things like if you'd have like a food wrapper and it's super thin, or you have there's all these different grades of plastic where it gets more complicated. But I think still recycling bottles, if you use them, glass bottles or otherwise, can be helpful also, I would say, because people, at least in my neighborhood, make a couple bucks off of it. So those kind of like specific programs, I think in the meantime, while we figure out how to completely get rid of plastic, I think are good. But overwhelmingly, yeah, it is really unfortunate that we've been kind of sold this lie that like recycling is going to save us from the horrors of plastic, and like that picture we saw earlier of the mound of plastic, and it's unfortunately not true. But I'm so excited that you are making those switches, and I hope that they're feel good for you and your family. So that's great.
Yes, I totally agree. I will continue recycling the bottles and the glass bottles and everything, but I know my mom's on here, so she's probably listening. So we're trying to have her reduce all the water bottles she buys. So with the filter we have, I hopefully that will be a solution. Fill up our stainless steel water bottle.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Michelle. And I echo Tiana. I'm so glad to hear that you're making some of those changes and that it feels good for you and for your family. And I'm just gonna say, because I can see in the chat that there's a question from Nikita about whether it's better to use glass bottles. Yeah, glass bottles are good. Glass in general is good. Like glass doesn't contaminate like drinks or food in the way that plastic does. So in general, like if it's something that you think would work for you and for your family, like I would say generally it's good to get like some glass Tupperwares and like potentially glass bottle. I mean, glass bottles are a little bit hard, I feel like, just from a practical standpoint, just from a like carrying a glass bottle around with you and like not shattering it into a million pieces when you inevitably drop your water somewhere. Just speaking from personal experience, I feel like that's what would happen to me if I tried to use a glass bottle all the time. But definitely like stainless steel, like there are lots of like stainless steel like water bottles and so on that are good as containers for your water, and also like good so that you don't have to keep purchasing plastic bottles and so on. And I also
I would just so
okay.
for that question, I would say reusable glass is definitely way better. So like glass Tupperware containers, you can microwave in glass as opposed to plastic. Single-use glass, unfortunately, while it is better for health in terms of contamination, can be complicated because the things that are made overseas, glass is heavier than plastic, so it has to ship really, really far. And so that can have kind of the similar issues of just more carbon intensive and more poor for the environment. So single-use glass is not as good for the environment, but good for your health. So I would say like the best of both is reusable glass. And for me, it's like if I go to Trader Joe's and I get a juice that comes in a glass container, then I just try to reuse that glass container a few times before I toss it into the recycling bin or put it in the recycling bin. And then for Tupperware, I typically try to use glass Tupperware instead of plastic Tupperware, especially when I want to microwave it. And then there's also some stainless steel Tupperware, but that's just annoying because you can't microwave stainless steel Tupperware. So yeah, there's definitely some other options, and glass is a good one most of the time.
Yes, I will also add on to that like this is a thought I had quite recently. Maybe this is helpful, maybe it's not. I think I realized too about glass Tupperwares recently. generally glass Tupperware is great. Like Tiana says, great that you can put them in the microwave too and reheat your food in them. It did occur to me the other day though that I, for a long time, had been using my glass Tupperwares and then reheating my food with the little plastic lid that comes with your glass Tupperware on top of my glass Tupperware and the food in it. And then I realized that that's really bad too. So now I just have like a little plate that I put on top of my my glass Tupperware when I reheat. So I'm just putting that out there in case anyone else was unthinkingly doing the same thing as me. And in case that advice helps anyone. Yeah, great. That's a great suggestion in the chat. Like reusing your glass bottles to put dry goods in. Yeah. Yeah, because I think like Tiana said, like glass is generally great. It's just like bad if like glass is something that you use once and then you smash it into some kind of recycling bit, or just put it in the trash, right? Like I think it's kind of hard to find glass recycling, and you have to go to like a specific outlet where they have that. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for sharing your thoughts and sharing what you've been thinking about doing, or what you try and alternatives that you try to use instead. It's really exciting to hear that so many of you are thinking about this, and like I said, like small changes are really like the way to go on this front. Like there's no point in trying to change your entire life and your entire approach to everything overnight. So it's good to, just chip away at these things slowly. Okay. So let's move on, if we're all okay with that, to talking about water a bit. I'm conscious of the time. We're like halfway through our time now, and I don't want to overrun and take up more of your evening. So let's talk about tap water a bit, right? Okay. And particularly, I'm going to be talking about water quality, like the quality of tap water in South LA, but some of this stuff will apply to thinking about tap water in the US more generally, and some of it will just apply to LA more generally too. Okay, so again, I just wanted to open with a quick sort of scan of the room, the virtual room, if you will, and just wanted to kind of ask if any of you have any particular things that you worry about with your water quality, with your tap water, like any particular things that you think about or that you have open questions about, or any of the above. And again, feel free to just share in the chat. Yeah, Nikita, contamination. Yeah. Yes, that is a good flag, Tiana. I'll just say that out loud. Just for anyone that does maybe need to leave early, because we understand that it's, now coming on 7 p.m. on a weekday evening. That we do have, as BWW, we have some reusable water pitchers with filters in them that we can distribute. As Michelle was saying earlier, she came to our last water event and got one there. But if you would like one of those water filters, you should feel free to email Tiana, who's dropped her email address into the chat, to coordinate pickup. Because we can't ship them, but you're very welcome to come to us and pick them up. Okay, so contamination, just stuff in the water. Anna wondering whether she should be using a filter instead of drinking LA tap water. Remembering when you first bought a water filter and saw how many particles and pollutants were in the water. So I take it that the general worry, right, is that there's like stuff in the water that's bad for us. Like, okay, and Nikita more particularly worries about lead, medications, toxins, etc. Yeah, like all very normal things for us to worry about, right? Like not normal in that it's, a good thing that we should have to worry about these things being in our tap water, but normal in that these are the kinds of concerns that I think it's very common for people to have about their tap water. So again, thank you for sharing. Okay, so I feel like really those of you that showed up today already know this, but like, why does the quality of our water matter? Essentially, the quality of our water matters, right? Because there's a really strong link between water and public health, right? So there's a strong link between the water that we drink and the water that we use for our cooking and to wash in and so on, and us maintaining good health. So around 7 million Americans get sick every year from diseases that are spread through water. So particularly vulnerable populations to contaminated water, or to water that does have contaminants or things in it that might make us sick, children, pregnant women, elderly people, and the immunocompromised, right? And like some of those categories, so like particularly like children and elderly people, or like children, so you can see in this little like chart that I've got here, like it's inevitable that children are particularly affected by contaminated water, because if you can see, like newborns, 80% of their bodies are made up of water, right? Like, whereas by the time you reach adulthood, it's closer to like 50-60%, which is still a lot though, right? So like, of course, there's such a strong link between water and our health if so much of our bodies are comprised of water. Okay, so just wanted to flag here that in California, since 2012, we do all have a legally recognized right to water, right? So just, this is now in California's constitution, so just that every human being has the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water adequate for human consumption, cooking, and sanitary purposes. So, but of course, the actuality of our human right to water, right, like the access that we all have to water that is safe and clean and affordable, isn't equitable, right? Like, it's not even. In particular, I feel like problems with water equity, and by water equity, we just mean like everyone's right to have access to safe, clean, affordable water, regardless of race, income, other socioeconomic factors like that, right? I feel like problems in the US is plagued with water problems, right? And like some of these problems are very publicized. Probably the most famous incident, right? It was the Flint water crisis in 2014, right? So there were all those images of the water in Flint. It was really brown, because and in that case, like one or two of you said that you worry about lead in the water. That was a problem with a lot of lead getting into the water. So across the country and here in LA, in general, unfortunately, right, again, we have this situation where low-income communities and communities of color are more likely to have their right to water violated because of things like historical disinvestment in those neighborhoods, right, redlining, things like that, that mean that the infrastructure is essentially much more outdated, and environmental racism means that those areas are more likely to have things like aging pipes or contaminated groundwater and so on and so forth. Okay. Oh, and these are just images from the thing I was just talking about. So the Flint water crisis in 2014. So there's just like an image of some of the contaminated water. And then here on the right is just an image from LA back in 2018. This was a problem in Compton where there was one very small water district where the water was contaminated, I believe, with manganese, which turned the water brown like that for a while. Again, because the infrastructure was really outdated and so on. Okay, so just quickly, water equity in South LA. So to talk about factors that affect the quality and the affordability of our water in South LA, so our tap water, just a few things that mean that we might worry about the tap water, or that raise questions about the tap water, right? Like, having said that, I realize there's a tension in this because earlier I did say that generally tap water is generally better for you than bottled water, right? There's like a tension in that because that is generally true, right? And like lots of tap water across LA is of decent quality, right? But there are just like certain factors that might affect tap water in different places. And because it's such a complicated issue, and it like really depends on like which particular pipes supply your water and which particular water utility supplies your water and so on, it's a really complicated story. But anyway, just a few of the factors that might affect your tap water, the tap water that comes to you in your home. Just number one, LA, super reliant on imported water, right? Like, we all know that we live in a like not a water-rich part of the country, right? Like, really, LA shouldn't exist where it does, right? Like, the idea of having this big metropolis here with millions of people in this area where there's not very much natural free-flowing water, a terrible idea, right? But here we all are, and essentially what that means is that at the moment, like over 2/3 of the water that we use in LA comes from outside of LA, right? And essentially that's important because it means that the water travels a really long way to reach us, which means that it has like lots of opportunities to be contaminated while it's traveling. And it also affects the affordability of our water, right? Because it means that it's really expensive to transport it and then to treat it so that you can try and get these contaminants out. Outdated and neglected water infrastructure is another factor. I've already talked about that really, so I won't spend more time on that now. Extreme weather conditions across California, again, this is just, you know, like we're in drought a lot of the time, and now we're out of drought. Part of the reason we came out of drought was because, you know, we had all of that heavy rain last year and then all of the flooding, right? So we have this kind of climate where we flip-flop between not enough water, too much water, and all of that kind of affects the steady supply of water to our taps and how affordable it is. And then just the other thing that I just wanted to flag is that there's a really decentralized water management system in LA, and particularly in South LA, right? So in South LA, there are 57 different water utilities that are supplying tap water. And this is what you can see on this map here, right? There are all these kind of like yellow and pink blotches showing the areas of LA where essentially there are small water utilities that supply people's tap water, right? Like LADWP, Department of Water and Power, supply like, I think about half of the residents of LA County with their water, but then the other half, it's really a lot of different suppliers, and lots of them are quite small suppliers. And essentially that means that when there are small suppliers, they tend to have less money, fewer resources, so it can be hard for them to maintain infrastructure and all of these things that are so important for us to have good quality tap water. Okay, so since so many of you asked about or like worry about water contaminants, I just wanted to talk about a couple of water contaminants that we might particularly worry about. I know lead is the big one, right? Lead is the one that, again, comes up in the news a lot, right? Like with the Flint situation. And that's partly because lead is so toxic, right? It's so toxic and it turns the water so obviously toxic looking. And it's so widespread because essentially when lead gets into the water, the reason that lead gets into the water is because it comes from pipes that transport our water into our homes that contain lead. Because until, I think it was until 1986, it was legal and very common for the pipes that transport our water to be made of lead. At that point, they were banned, right? And like there was a transition to pipes made of different materials. But of course, because there hasn't been enough investment in replacing all the lead pipes with other materials, there are still lead pipes around in some areas, particularly areas where the housing and the pipes and the infrastructure supplying those housing are older than the 1980s, right? Okay. And then I've just put chromium-6 here as another potential water contaminant. There are loads of potential water contaminants, right? But this one I've just put because it is relatively common in LA in high concentrations. I think it's been found in higher concentrations in South LA than in some of the rest of LA. It's a metallic element that enters the water supply through wastewater that's been contaminated by industrial processes. And it's linked to respiratory problems, digestive issues, potential developmental issues in children, and so on. But I want to flag for all these contaminants, like it's not inevitable that these contaminants are in your tap water. Like don't panic, like you probably don't have lead in your water, right? But just like these are the things that, yeah, these are the contaminants that are of the most concern. So I think it's just good to know what they are. And we're going to move on shortly to like talking about how to try and tell if any of these contaminants are in your water and like what to do if you're worried there is a particular contaminant in your water. Okay, I just wanted to raise these two just because we did talk about plastics in the first half of this session. So I just wanted to flag these two contaminants to kind of link our topics, right? Because these are kind of contaminants that are often found in water that can get into our drinking water from plastics, essentially. So microplastics, I won't say much about because we already talked about them so much. But essentially, microplastics are found in like bottled water, as we talked about, but also because, as we talked about, microplastics are everywhere in our built environment and around us. Inevitably, lots of tap water will also contain small levels of microplastics, right? And then the other thing I've got here is PFAS. So that's this family of man-made chemicals that are highly toxic, that are very bad for us, that are often referred to, and you might have heard referred to as forever chemicals. So They're found often in flame retardants, household cleaners, cosmetics, and so on. And remember, it's important that they're found in flame retardants because if you'll recall, right at the beginning when I was talking about plastics and how plastics are made from fossil fuels and then chemicals are added to them, right? I said like some of those chemicals that are added as flame retardants because since plastic's made of fossil fuels, if you don't add flame retardants, then plastic stuff would just catch fire all the time, right? So like PFAS are often found in plastic products and then get into our water supplies. So I just got this figure here that in 2007, PFAS were super ubiquitous back then, and they were found in the blood of 97% of Americans, which is a crazy statistic. Since then, that number has gone down a bit because PFAS have been banned in some setting, or some classes of PFAS have been banned. So the number is decreasing, but it is still higher than you would want it to be. Like I think it's still higher than 50%. And also just as a side note, by forever chemicals, that doesn't actually mean like they're not actually in your body forever and ever, right? Otherwise that percentage would never go down. They just take a really, really long time to leave your body, like years and years and years, you know, whereas most things like caffeine, alcohol, like most things that we imbibe leave our bodies within a couple of days, right? Okay. So I won't say much about this because I feel like we've already talked about bottled water so much and I don't want to beat the same drum again and again, but just often for all of these reasons and for all these things that we've talked about and because of the kinds of contaminants that we've talked about, often drinking bottled water is not better for us than drinking tap water, right? And I've just put a few other things on here. So, I mean, for one, like drinking bottled water is really expensive, right? Like tap water is cheap, whereas bottled water is much more expensive. It's much more expensive to have to buy all of your water in bottles than it is to just use the water that comes out of your tap, or even to buy a filter, right? And then to filter the water that comes through your tap. Like that will be much cheaper in the long run. Also, bottled water is subject to less regulation than tap water. So like part of the reason that I say that most of us in LA have like pretty decent quality tap water is because like our tap water is subject to a bunch of regulations by the EPA and so on, right? Like many contaminant levels are controlled and our water is treated so that those contaminant levels don't exceed a certain amount, right? Whereas bottled water, there's far less regulation about the levels of contaminants that are permissible in water that's sold to us in bottles like this. So actually, chances are that your tap water is better, like might contain fewer contaminants than that bottled water does. Housed in plastic bottles, we've talked about that. And then just that there are a couple of ways in which plastic bottles of water are particularly unsustainable, right? They're unsustainable, like first, because it sustains this life cycle of plastic that we're talking about, because essentially it means that you have to keep producing these plastics and so on. But also it's unsustainable just because it involves like the water that's in bottled water like comes from somewhere, right? Like it involves removing that water from, in all likelihood, like a poorer, less well-off area of the world or of the country that then won't have that water, and then the environment there also won't have that water. So like it then affects those people and also those environments that you take the water from. So I think all of that is just worth bearing in mind. Okay, and now just, I don't want to just throw all this information at you and then just end on doom and gloom. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about things that you can do about your water concerns, right? So if you are worried about that. So first, just these things are just knowing more stuff about your water, if you are particularly worried about your tap water, is going to help you out, right? Like it's just good to know more, to know whether you do need to be concerned, right? And then if you are concerned and if you learn more and then find out, oh, there is actually this contaminant in my water, like if you know more about your tap water and know what that contaminant is, then you have more power to actually do something about it to protect yourself. If you choose to. You also don't have to do any of this, right? Like you don't have to go out there and investigate your tap water. Like you know, it's not your responsibility. It's more just if you are curious or if you are concerned, these are steps that you can take. So first is just, I'm sure most of you probably do, but like first is just to know who it is, like which utility it is that actually supplies your tap water, right? And if you don't know, you can just check your water bill, you can ask your landlord, or there is like a lookup tool that you can use just to check which utility covers you. And then if you do know which water utility supplies your water, then every water utility has to produce this annual water quality report, right? So every year they have to produce this and they have to make it available to you. Like you should be able to find it on their website, or if it's a really small water utility, you can call them and ask for it, but like they're legally required to do this. And that will list like where your drinking water comes from, so the source of your drinking water, and then it will list all of the levels of contaminants that are regulated in your water, so you can see which contaminants are in your water and how high they are and so on and so forth. Third thing, so if what you're particularly worried about is aging pipes, so if you're worried about lead that's in your water, unfortunately the water quality report is not going to tell you about whether there's lead in your water in all likelihood, because it will tell you about the quality of your water when it leaves the water treatment plant where it's treated, right? But the thing that's so pernicious about lead is that if lead is in your water, there's lead in your water because essentially in the process of your water being transported to your tap, that's where the lead might get into your water. So like if you have a particular worry about lead, the easiest thing to do is to have your tap water tested. It's worth reaching out to your water utility if you are interested in this, because some of them will offer this for free. But otherwise, if like lead is the thing that you're particularly worried about and that you would like to have an answer with, there are home tests that you can get. I mean, there are home tests that you can get that will test your water for a bunch of different contaminants, but also if lead is your main worry, there are very reliable home test kits that you can get that just test your water for lead. And I think they cost about $20. So they're like fairly affordable if like that's the question that you want an answer to. And then fourth, just if your tap water is smelly, tastes bad, discolored, like if you ever experience like a problem with your tap water, report it, right? Like tell your landlord, if you have a landlord, tell the Department of Public Health, tell Cal EPA, right? Like there are a bunch, tell your local elected official, like there are a bunch of different people that you can report that to if that were to happen, which hopefully it won't. And then the other thing you can do is you can use a water filter, right? So using a water filter at home is one of the easiest ways that you can, if you have concerns about your tap water, it's one of the easiest ways to just do something proactive about your water concern, right? Because water filters, the whole point of them is that they remove some of the contaminants that are in your water from your water. I just put a note in here that different filters are better at treating different contaminants, right? So like if you are particularly knowledgeable about your tap water, or if there's like a particular kind of contaminant that you're like, I hear that that's sometimes in tap water and I really don't want to consume that, then there will be filters that are better than some other filters at treating that particular kind of thing, at removing that particular thing from the water. So that's just something to keep in mind if you were doing water filter research, or if you were to recommend a water filter to someone else. And I've just put, make sure your filter, it should just have a little sticker on it or a little thing saying that it's NSF certified. And essentially that just means that it meets certain regulations, and that it is actually removing stuff from your water, right? Like that it's actually doing the job that it says it will. And then the final thing I've just put here, because this is super important and I am definitely guilty of it, or I have been guilty of it, right? Like the thing that you need to know is that if you do choose to use a water filter to try and get contaminants out of your tap water, then you've got to remember to change the water filter. If you use an old water filter for too long, then your water filter will stop working, right? Like it'll stop removing contaminants from water, and it might even then make the water like less safe for you to drink. And that's because essentially like the way that a water filter works is it works by it's a sort of sponge and it sort of soaks in the contaminants that's in your water. But then if your water filter is really, really old, like the bit in the middle, then it's soaked in all the contaminants that it can take. And then essentially it will start releasing them again, right? Like back into the water that you're drinking. So super annoying, but you've got to remember to change the water filter. And most filters, like it'll say on the filter when you get it, but many water filters, you've got to change it every 2 or 3 months. Okay. And like I said, just on the water filter front, if you do want a water filter, because we do have them and we are giving them out, if you do want to come by the office to pick one up, just shoot Tiana an email and we can sort that out. Okay, so just a few closing thoughts then, to wrap up. Just a quick recap of things that we've talked about that you can do to protect yourself, just with plastics. Reduce your usage. You can seek alternatives where possible, especially when it comes to food and drink. avoid heating your food in plastic, and then try to limit buying synthetic clothing. And then with the water, find out where your water comes from to find out more about potential contaminants. Use a water filter and avoid drinking from plastic bottles where possible. Like all of these things where possible. I also realized I should put, just to say, like, if any of you have any questions about that water section, feel free to drop them in the chat. Just because I realized there wasn't a discussion chunk at the end, so I just want you to feel free to ask any of your questions if you have any, and if you don't have any, absolutely no worries, Okay, I just wanted to also, again, if I can get Zoom to cooperate with me, it worked the first time, so here's hoping for time 2. I just wanted to launch a little closing poll. If you would all bear with me here. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so hopefully you should see that. Let me know if you don't see that. But just a little closing poll about this session, essentially about how helpful you found it, about, yeah. So we would very much appreciate it if you could fill that out, because we want to be able to design these workshops so that they're helpful for you and so that they actually answer the questions that you have and answer the concerns that you worry about and so on. And then at the same time, I just wanted to open up the space for you to like drop in the chat if you want to, whether there's anything in particular that you would like to see in the future on these topics. Like, are there any like particular resources that you would want, or like anything in particular that you would like to know about plastic or water that we didn't cover today? Yeah, just in terms of like guiding what we do with our plastic pollutions program next year and our water program, we would just love to hear from you if there's anything in particular that you found particularly interesting or that you would want to hear more about, or resources that you would want. But as always, absolutely no pressure. And if you're just happy with everything, then that's absolutely fantastic too. Okay, advocacy efforts, how can we make changes? Yeah, I mean, that's a very valid thing to raise, Nikita. I think, like making changes on the systemic level is like really, really important for these things because, like I said so many times in the plastic section, like really lots of this is coming from like a few big companies that have a lot of investment in plastics. And also on the waterfront, like lots of the problems with tap water come from outdated infrastructure, which is a thing that again is systemic, right? So yeah, I think at BWW, we are thinking definitely about advocacy efforts that we can pursue that make sense for us to pursue going forwards. I don't know if you want to say more about this, Tiana, or if you just want to sort of do a watch this space.
Yeah, so our plastics and water programs are kind of newer programs, so we're still kind of figuring out where we want to jump into the advocacy spaces. But right now there's ongoing campaigns around addressing some of the bigger polluters. So like Coca-Cola is one of the bigger polluters of plastic, but then addressing the producers as well. And the biggest producer of plastic is actually ExxonMobil, which is a fossil fuel company. In LA, there's different possibilities around kind of municipality actions or trying to figure out how to kind of to the points that Zoe made about there being 57 utilities and underfunded and all of these things, figuring out different funding options. But previously we supported an advocacy effort around utility shutoffs because another kind of part of this water complication is even if whether you have good water or poor water or whatever it might be, there's the water affordability part of all of this, which is that for some, especially in South LA, actually has some of the highest rates of water utility bills. And so questions around water affordability as well. So kind of to Zoe's point, we're kind of figuring out where we want to jump into different advocacy efforts. And so forums like this and hearing from you all has been helpful. As it relates to the plastic, we had an event in September where we asked the same question and people talked about a lot of like local solutions, so working with small businesses around transitioning away from plastic, then like big business advocacy. So we're kind of jumping in and out of some things. But I will say, because we do so much work around oil drilling, trying to eliminate oil drilling in LA, that automatically will make our water better in Los Angeles, not having contaminants into it, as well as less oil, less plastic. So kind of inadvertently, that's our advocacy right now, but we're building out programming for 2024.
Great. Thank you so much for jumping in, Tiana. And thank you all so much for, thank you all so much for coming and for taking part in these polls and for being so open to discussing and contributing your ideas to us. Oh, Michelle, go on. Please go forth.
I'm considering creating some vegan meal prep meals, and I've been researching the containers to put them in. Of course, I don't want to put them in plastic, so I found some that you can compost or that are biodegradable, but the lids are still plastic. They say they're PP lids, polypropylene. Not sure if I said that right. And I know that they decompose faster than the other plastic lids. So is there any other alternatives, or is that the best I can do? Get the bottom of the container for the meal to be, it can compost or biodegradable, but the lid, see, a PP lid. I mean, if you can help me out and give me some suggestions, I would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michelle. Honestly, I'm with you. Like that's sort of what I was sharing earlier when I was talking about the microwavable glass Tupperwares and how, you know, like I really like the glass Tupperwares that I have, but it frustrates me a bit that all the lids are plastics, so then I can't microwave them with those lids. And then, if it's a soup, you've got to find something to put on top of it, otherwise it's gonna splatter all over your microwave. I've got to say, personally, off the top of my head, I don't know if you have anything, Tiana, but personally, off the top of my head, I don't have anything. But like that kind of thing is certainly the kind of thing we can look into uh um for our work around plastics going forwards, because I do think, like Tiana said, like lots of what people have expressed interest in are like finding alternatives that are like sustainable and like also like affordable that like, we can actually use in our daily lives. So I think that's like definitely something that even if I don't have, an answer for you right on the spot, like that we can look into.
Okay, I'll keep researching as well.
Yeah, thank you for those of you like speaking in the chat too. Yeah, that we need more legislation which forces fast food restaurants to eliminate plastic utensils, etc. It shouldn't be voluntary. All true. And then some of you saying even when you ask for no utensils, you still get them. Like on the advocacy front, I think there is also some action on this front too, in that I think like California is shepherding through a bill that will work to not quite eliminate, but yeah, to really like cut down on single-use plastics, right? And that is like a legislative route that will like, I think that's supposed to come into effect. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Tiana. I think that's supposed to come into effect in 2025 or 2026, and then it's aiming for a goal of like reducing single-use plastic by a certain point in like a decade or so. And we are, I think, becoming involved with that, with like seeing that legislation through. So like that is something that there are advocacy efforts on that front in California, that we are involved in, and that hopefully will try and cut down on these things. And like Tiana said, I also think there are potentially efforts that we might pursue next year in terms of like also just like working with local businesses and so on and so forth to also try and cut down on plastic use and try and make some progress on these issues.
Yeah, I think it gets complicated because so when we're talking about like the systems change, there's kind of the way we think about it is often there's the things like upstream versus downstream. So if we're talking like upstream, then that's the fossil fuel produce or the plastic producers, so the people who are making plastic. When we're talking downstream, that's like a fast food restaurant that uses plastic or a local business that uses plastic. A lot of legislation focuses on the business, so saying like you as a business need to stop using these plastic materials. And some of that can be good, especially as it relates to these mega companies like McDonald's and others that have the money to switch. But what we really try hard not to do is to harm small businesses who have maybe slimmer margins and aren't able to switch or don't have options, or it's harder to access in certain communities. So what we really want to do, and what a lot more advocacy is transitioning to, is instead of forcing businesses to switch, but forcing companies to switch. So forcing Exxon to stop producing single-use plastic, and then that will make other alternatives come up faster. So really trying to be as really trying to address the problem from its root, from its core, so that it has a lot more downstream effects. So that's kind of, but of course, getting these big mega 500 Fortune 500 companies to not produce the thing that makes them billions and billions of dollars is very complicated. So then again, we do the let's talk about to businesses and let's get local people to use this plastic, or let's get a consumer to use plastic. And then lastly, I'll say another thing is one of the things we talked earlier about how the plastic industry, fossil fuel companies like to use recyclability as an excuse as to why plastic is okay. Another thing that fossil fuel companies do, and it's connected to recyclability, is to make it seem like the answer is about consumer choice. Like if you and I just choose to stop using plastic, there would be no more plastic. But plastic is actually one of the few, not few, but plastic is one of the materials in the world that was completely pushed on consumers, that consumers did not want. Actually, a lot of when plastic was produced in this or created in the 60s, and real broad spectrum created in the 60s, it was created earlier than that. Companies actually had a really hard time getting people to use plastic because they didn't want to. And they had to do a lot of advertising in order to get people to even use the plastic. So it's really the solution, quote unquote, is not about us just choosing not to use it, because it's hard, especially in certain areas, to not use it. It's really, really hard. The solution really is for companies to stop producing it, and then for us to switch to other things. And they will like to keep saying it's just about us choosing, but we know that while consumer choice matters, they're the ones that are pushing this down our throats. We're not the one asking for more plastic. So that, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you for jumping in, Tiana. That's all yeah, that's all really important stuff, right? Like that it's a system problem and it's not not an us problem, right? Like that's kind of like the other side of the coin of the, like, you know, don't take on too much responsibility yourself, because it's not about the individual choices that we make, right? It's about the companies that are pushing these things on us and that are creating all of the harm. So yeah, that was a great intervention. Thank you. Okay, great. Well, thank you all. I think, don't let me cut anyone off if you've got anything else, but I think that's probably bringing our session to a close. So that was just, you know, watch this space. As Tiana said, we're still in the early stages of these programs, so we're still filling out what it is we want to do going forwards with our plastics pollution and water equity programs. And then just a little flag here, just that in early 2024, very early, we hope, there's this very comprehensive like water guide resource that we've produced that we'll publish online, that will go into more detail about water equity in South LA and provide more resources for addressing your water concerns. So if if this water section was particularly interesting to you, or if you want to know more about contaminants or about the problems facing us with tap water in LA, or like the history of water in LA, any of the above things, keep your eyes peeled for that. And yeah, here are some of the resources that we drew from for this presentation. But generally, we just want to say thank you so much for all coming out to be with us in this virtual room. We really appreciate it, and we really love hearing from you and about the things that concern you and the things that you want to know more about, and that you want us to see more, that you want to see more of on our side. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for engaging. And yeah, we hope to see you again at another BWW event. Hopefully lots more exciting stuff coming down the pipe to you in 2024. And yeah, I hope you all have a really wonderful rest of your evening and a rest of your year and a great holiday season. All of the above. Bye all.
You want to stop recording? It should go straight to the cloud.
Yes, good point.